Hello, my name is Bob Ascah, and I'm hosting a series of conversations with well-known Albertans. In 2023, Albertans are facing two very different visions of the future. In this series, I hope to engage viewers in a deep dive on three fundamental areas which require thoughtful consideration by the provincial government. The first area is fiscal policy. In this field, we will canvass the structure of Alberta's finances and how Alberta can move away from the roller coaster fiscal effects of a boom and bust economy. The second area is economic. Every time there is a bust in the economy, the inevitable response from government is to trot out the words economic diversification, as if speaking these words will make this happen. And finally, the state of Alberta's political system. Many Albertans feel distrustful of their government. This is a phenomenon not unique to Alberta. Increasingly, voters are turned off from politics. A pox on both parties is not an uncommon response. Partisanship and polarization are increasingly common. The trumpet phenomenon and autocrats in other countries point to a resurgence of authoritarianism, which threatens democratic institutions. What to do? Joining me this morning for the second conversation in this ongoing series is Laurie Williams, an associate professor of political science in Mount Royal University's Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies. Her research and teaching interests include Canadian politics, women in politics, law, charter rights, political philosophy, ethics, power and technology, including social media, a very wide net. She is an active commentator on the media and in the media.
Carbon tax, two controversial words right now in our country. Earlier this year, Alberta has been on the sidelines watching all of this. I'm joined by Laurie Williams from Mount Royal University. What does this mean for Alberta? Where do we go from? Where does the Premier go from here?
Well, that's a big question because Doug Ford is being criticized fairly significantly.
Municipal, provincial, and national political life. In particular, she has contributed chapters in Orange Chinook about the 2015 election victory of the NDP and Blue Storm about the UCP's victory in 2019 and their labor policies. Welcome, Laurie, to the conversation.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you.
I wonder, Professor Williams, if you could fill out a little more of your background, where you grew up, went to school, and how you became a respected political scientist.
First of all, I'd like it if you would call me Laurie, not big on titles. So I was born in Saskatoon, came to Calgary when I was fairly young with my dad, who was in the oil industry. And I've done most of my schooling here, some work in other locations, but because of family considerations, this is where my formal education took place. I've always been, I think I started out sort of interested in particularly medical ethics. It sort of bridged my two great passions. I'm really interested in medicine, and I'm also really interested in philosophy. And so in my first year, I took a philosophy course that really piqued my interest and had a foot in both worlds for a while, and finally settled on thinking that I would do politics and philosophy together, talking about how the world ought to be. And then in terms of my research interests, just because of the courses that I have developed and taught over the years, the connections that I've had with other researchers and colleagues, I teach in a department that has economists as well as political scientists. And so I think it's broadened my vision considerably. I really enjoy the conversations we have, and amongst other things, the conversations I'm able to have with our students who have that same sort of range of training and foundation. It's unusual, I guess I should say, to be able to just have a conversation with someone of the age of most of my students who seem to understand things, or are at least able to critically assess those things in the way that our students do.
Great. So before we examine in more detail the three issues I think will be high on a new government's agenda, perhaps, Laurie, you can give your view on what other issues a new government will need to address in the coming 4 years.
Well, according to polls over an extended period of time, we're dealing with two primary issues. Healthcare seems to be top of mind for most Albertans, and indeed that's a problem across the country, but particularly a problem here in Alberta because of the animosity that sort of has evolved between the United Conservative government, Jason Kenney, his health minister, Tyler Shandro, even to a certain extent Travis Taves. During a pandemic, not perhaps the wisest strategy, and something I question in that chapter in the book. But healthcare here is particularly problematic. As we know, there are 20 vacant spaces for family medicine in Alberta. Nobody has matched to come to those spaces. And so it looks like, even though in some ways Alberta is doing better than some other places, we're doing worse on this particular file. That is recruiting and retaining staff, those health workers feeling respected. That just seems to be a particular wound. And so for that issue, both in terms of what NDP parties are expected to be good at, because of Rachel Notley's own record, we look back at what healthcare was doing under her premiership. I think she's got the edge on that. The other big issue is affordability. And although affordability does touch on the economy, and conservative parties tend to be given an edge when it comes to economic issues, this isn't just about economic issues, it's about affordability. And the United Conservative government has had a number of policies that have made things more expensive. So utilities, auto insurance payments, things like that are more expensive. AISH and other social programs were de-indexed. That's recently been corrected by the UCP. So I think that's a bit more of a mixed thing. I think that both the NDP and the UCP have something to offer there. But we're still looking at an election where there are a lot of folks that either haven't decided how to vote, or in some cases whether to vote. They're really in a difficult position in terms of trying to decide who is best to lead us into whatever the vision of the future might be. And those visions are overlapping in lots of ways that you wouldn't expect. A lot of people are surprised that the Conservatives are creating policies that look very much like they would be NDP policies, and the NDP is talking about reducing taxes on small businesses, for example. So it's a much more sort of mixed bag, and I think because of that, the emphasis or focus has increasingly been on the leaders, and because they're all going to, whoever wins is going to have the same amount of money to work with, who is more competent, more stable, more trustworthy in terms of accomplishing those objectives. And that's still quite a battle here in Alberta.
Well, that's a good segue, Laurie, into the question and discussion around fiscal policy and healthcare policy. And so what I'd like to do is quote from Danielle Smith's 2021 paper, which has gained quite a lot of notoriety, that she wrote for the School of Public Policy in 2021. Quote, "This is the fundamental conundrum of Alberta. We want gold-plated services, and we don't want to pay more taxes for them. Politicians are to blame for maintaining the fiction that this was sustainable. Anyone who proposes an alternative to raise taxes, the sales tax is the most obvious source of long-term revenue, the province could adopt to solve the structural shortfall. It is instantly shot down by politicians fearing they won't be reelected." Also, she made the comment in that article that it's not a problem of diversifying the economy. It's a problem for government to diversify their revenue source. And we'll put up a slide showing the up and down nature of royalty revenue as a percentage of own source revenue. And I'm sure you've seen this. This is from my work as well as Tomes and others. And it basically goes like this. So Tell me a little bit about this. Is partly, well, what's in the mind of Danielle Smith? You have, one expects to read an article that somebody would stand by. So can you maybe talk a little bit, based on your research, on the chameleon nature of certain politicians and what that does in the political culture, and perhaps what that might mean for this election?
I think, first of all, I think it's interesting to note that there seemed to be support for a sales tax as a better solution to the revenue roller coaster in Alberta. That this seems to be something that Danielle Smith is supportive of, and now she's accusing the NDP and Rachel Notley of secretly planning to impose a sales tax. I talk to economists all the time who talk about sales tax as being a solution to the problem. But the so-called Alberta advantage, this phrase that was quoted or coined rather by Ralph Klein, what it means is high-level government services and low taxes. And the only reason that's been possible historically is, of course, because those revenues that have been generated by the oil and gas industry, the royalty revenues that have come in, and just the economic activity, energy that is emerged out of that. I would profoundly disagree with one of the things she's saying, is that it's that this idea that government needs to diversify its sources of revenues. That may be one of the things that needs to be looked at, but the future of Alberta as a healthy economy, as an innovative sort of world leader on energy, and not just oil and gas kinds of energy. And there are some that are doing leading research in that area. That's key, and providing supports and a welcoming environment for folks to come in to do that kind of research, to have stable sort of funding and supports in place so that can take place. And you're right, you've said earlier that diversification is something that governments have been talking about since probably before Peter Lougheed, but really in a big way since Lougheed came into power. And it's just it's a difficult thing to do. It's a long-term challenge, and governments are in power for 4 or 5 years at a stretch. And the temptation, at least in Alberta, has always been to go in that other direction. So this sort of leads into the next sort of area that you were going to be talking about as well. But we look at, by contrast to places like Norway, where they have invested the oil and gas revenues in a fund that is now in the many trillions of dollars, as sort of a hedge against a future where oil and gas is going to be a lower source of revenue and wealth, and the economy has to be more diversified. The sources of revenue need to be more diverse. Now, the question then about what do we listen to in terms of what politicians have said? Now, obviously, there are politicians who say something and they give their reasons for changing their mind, and they explain the reasons, and you can see sort of the line of thinking that has occurred. I think the fact that Jason Kenney had a controversial series of statements that he'd made when he was very young and living in the United States and going to school there. Some of the things that he said, there's some even of the votes that he cast in the House of Commons were brought up, and they didn't have the same impact as the so-called bozo eruptions in the 2012 campaign in Alberta, where the Wild Rose, some people said the Wild Rose lost that election because of the extreme views that some candidates made, and the fact that Danielle Smith wasn't willing to stand up against the views they made. But I think that one of the differences is that the statements made by Jason Kenney were further back in history, and social issues weren't the primary focus in 2019. The primary focus, as the UCP slogan said, was jobs, economy, pipelines, and that's where people were looking. The sort of social issues weren't as big a problem. The difference here with Danielle Smith is she hasn't just said things about how the economy ought to be handled or the merits of a sales tax. She's made very controversial views around the whole issue of healthcare. What kind of healthcare is effective, suggesting that people can prevent and treat cancer without going to the medical system up until stage 4, which angered every person who has gotten cancer or has a loved one who's gotten cancer and has suffered as a result of it. Her openness to very controversial treatments and therapies like hydroxychloroquine and and ivermectin. Very critical remarks about doctors, saying that the doctors that weren't open to these alternatives, including things like homeopathy and naturopathy, which, you know, are highly questionable in terms of their efficacy. So she's saying doctors are incurious and that their brains are too full of medical school information, so they don't need to learn anymore. I mean, she's insulting the people that are the experts and are the ones that we rely on to deliver healthcare. And so that's a problem. That's not just sort of, are we going to have this system of taxation or that system of taxation? These raise questions about what is quality healthcare. They also raise questions about whether it ought to be public or private. And so she's made one sort of repeated statement recently about promising publicly funded healthcare, that you won't have to pay for healthcare. And she's saying that again and again. She's using this, which was a promise made by Jason Kenney when he was premier. He also promised that there would be no frontline healthcare workers that would lose their jobs, and over 11,000 were contracted out under his leadership. So I think the issue of trust around healthcare is a real problem here, because it's not just an economics question; it's a policy question. And I think the people that are waiting 6 or 8 weeks for a lab appointment don't care about whether or not they pay out of their pocket. They care about whether they're getting timely health care. It's not just about whether you pay, it's about whether you get the health care that you need in a timely way. And so those things, I think, that kind of record, that sort of suite or collection of statements has raised a lot of questions on the top issue for voters going into this election.
Last year, I wrote a column about her public policy paper, and I'll just quote from that relative to healthcare. She recommends that government match individual and employer donations with a $375 per year health spending account once people, quote, get used to the concept of paying out of pocket for more things. The conversation on healthcare will change from what services the government will delist to what services are paid for the government and what is paid out of the health spending account. Smith believes it's better for individuals to make their own decisions about what health providers to use. And this was also combined with this idea of charter surgical facilities and Mayo Clinic North, this kind of idea. Now, one of the questions that just came up in a conversation I had with some friends was, during the leadership campaign, what kind of research was being done by Taves and the other groups to unlock this, and what did they think about it? And your memory will be better on this as to whether they said anything about the health spending account, but certainly the sales tax issue didn't come out until I put an article about it in the journal, and then, suddenly we'll talk about it, but then we won't talk about it.
Well, when we look at that leadership campaign, most of the other candidates for the leadership disagreed with Danielle Smith on a whole range of issues, including her proposed Alberta Sovereignty Act. Her views on a number of issues did come up, but this information, which was readily available, lots of people have known for some time that some of these things are out there. But I think what was happening is that because of the relatively large number of candidates, what wound up happening is it looked like this collection of people was the alternative on one side, and Danielle Smith was on the other side. You put that together with the very well organized campaign by the Take Back Alberta folks. They organized they capitalized on dissent and frustration with Jason Kenney's leadership, but they were the ones who organized consistently and pushed under the very able leadership, frankly, of David Parker, who supported Jason Kenney for becoming the leader of the UCP and the premier. He turned against Jason Kenney, and he organized a campaign not only to get rid of Jason Kenney and to install Danielle Smith. It's important to remember that even with all of that organization, even with all that momentum, a tiny percentage of Albertans, less than about 1.5% of Albertans, were responsible for actually electing Danielle Smith. On the very last ballot, I think there have been 6 ballots prior to that, and she barely got more than 50%. So a really tiny percentage of Albertans. But right after that, David Parker and the Take Back Alberta folks won all 9 vacant seats on the United Conservative Party board. So this wasn't just a failure on the part of other candidates or opposition folks. It was a failure of internal organization within the United Conservative Party. There was no sort of alternative organization to challenge Danielle Smith in her bid for the leadership. They weren't as well organized as Take Back Alberta and David Parker were. If you look at the photographs of the final count, the final ballot, you look at who was sitting around Travis Taves. Almost everyone in the party supported Travis Taves. They could have lived with Travis Taves. Almost all of them opposed Danielle Smith, and I think that's another problem for the United Conservative Party, is that all of those folks that so vehemently opposed her during the leadership race have been relatively quiet since she's become premier, in spite of some of the very controversial and problematic things that she has said and done.
Is that mainly due, Lori, to the fact that as the premier, she appoints cabinet and committee assignments and that kind of thing?
I think probably the biggest factor is the fact there was an election coming up.
Yeah.
They had very little time between the new premier coming into office in October and the election that was due to come at the end of May. And so I think they were just sort of holding their tongues in the hopes that they could just win the election and try to pull something else out afterwards. I'm sure you're reading and hearing the same things that I am, that there are actual candidates, some incumbent MLAs, even cabinet ministers going to the doors and saying, vote for us, don't worry, we'll get rid of Danielle Smith once the election is over. But I would put a question to those folks. Who's organized enough to turn against Danielle Smith? The organized ones within the party are the Take Back Alberta folks. They are supportive of Danielle Smith. If she tries to tack to the center, they'll turn on her the same way that they did Jason Kenney. I just don't see the organization within the party to accomplish what they're talking about. I mean, we've seen conservative parties in Alberta repeatedly remove their leaders when they weren't getting the kind of support they needed in the polls. But if we look at this election, there's a good chance that a number of these sympathetic folks that are candidates in the election will be in there with Danielle Smith. And if they do get rid of Danielle Smith, they'll want to replace her with somebody who is further to the right, not somebody who's more moderate.
That does not mean Travis Taves coming back from the wilderness. They want somebody even more extreme.
Unless there's some sort of really coordinated organization done by the moderates within the party. But if they do that, then they risk another split within the party. Remember, the folks that are now basically in the most influential place within the party, those are the former Wild Rose people, and they have no interest in compromising. They have principles that they believe in, and are very passionate about the things they believe in, and they are extraordinarily well organized. They're not just talking about influencing politics at the provincial level. They're talking about school boards and city or municipal councils. So, they've definitely got an agenda. They've got the organization. Now that I think it's a bit more high profile, there may be others that try to sort of stand up against it. But some of the stalwarts within the old Progressive Conservative Party, and even very strong and influential people within the federal Conservative Party, are apparently quite powerless to deal with this. You look at Devin Dreeshen, whose father is an MP federally. His mother and uncle, I think, were tossed off the Constituency Association board by Take Back Alberta folks.
Right. The whole issue around Take Back Alberta it is an interesting one for me. I am the recipient of the free Alberta Strategy newsletter, the Alberta Institute, the Common Sense Calgary and Edmonton, and Project Confederation. And all their websites are almost identical, and it's the similar type of thing. Are they, and I'm getting them because I just want to understand what the political discourse is coming from in different perspectives. Is this an echo chamber, Lori, do you think, or are they um, are they able to kind of reach out and collect votes that are necessary to put Daniel Smith back in as premier again?
Well, that's part of the question. Of course, the for the United Conservative Party, the path to a majority is a much easier path than it is for the NDP, and that's something that I think some folks are counting on. I mean, it remains to be seen what will actually happen. We're hearing increasingly from people who have voted Conservative, whether it be Progressive Conservative, United Conservative. We're seeing those folks vote. Or sorry, say that they don't know how they're going to vote. They don't know if they're going to vote in some cases. Even some of them saying, I never thought I would ever vote or even think about voting NDP in my life, but I'm now voting NDP. And we just don't know how that's going to break. Insiders are just saying it's too close to call, and they don't feel confident betting either way. So the Take Back Alberta folks will not be the only force behind this. There are a lot of other things that are going on, a deep history and roots that exist in Alberta. But there's also in a lot of those, especially the rural urban constituencies where there's a combination, places like Red Deer, the donut around Edmonton, Banff, Kananaskis, maybe even places like Slave Lake, even perhaps Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo, where there's been a fight over who the nominee for the party should be, and there's a deep division within Conservatives in that particular riding. Put all that together for Slave Lake and Fort McMurray, put that together with the wildfire concerns. Possibly ridings like that are in play, and the impact of the Take Back Alberta folks might actually have sort of exposed some of the divisions within the party, and it could limit. In this particular election, it could limit their influence, but it's not like they are completely in control, but they're organized and they have enough influence and control. They've been successful at agitating and being, certainly a big part of the reason Jason Kenney was ultimately drummed out, and a big part of why Daniel Smith was brought in. They organized, had busloads of folks whose fees were paid to go to the AGM to get the seats on the board. It's not their numbers so much as their quiet influence, and the fact that there wasn't really an effective action in response to that has happened up until this point. So they're going to be a factor in this election, an outsized factor. In other words, far beyond their numbers, they're going to have an influence. And how that works in the future will depend on what kinds of responses are brought into play by others. But again, the challenge for the party is how do you recreate something like the Big Tent of the 44-year PC dynasty? How do you include people that are socially more progressive and fiscally more conservative? How do you combine social conservatives and libertarians? Social conservatives who oppose things like gay marriage and libertarians who think that that's an essential freedom. Even the meaning of freedom is something that is disagreed within the Take Back Alberta movement. But I think perhaps the most important distinction to draw here is when you look at poll after poll after poll over decades now, but certainly over the last few years, most Albertans identify themselves as moderate, as centrist, center right, center left. And if they see a party or a movement that is too far afield from them, that's going to create other divisions that are going to be problematic within the province. So I think the challenge for Conservative parties, both provincially and federally, is how do you contain these groups that really belong in at least two different, if not more, parties? How do you keep them rowing together to try to obtain and maintain political power? And I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. The other thing that really strikes me in this election, I have never seen anything like this, is the number of high-profile Conservatives that are speaking publicly and strongly against Daniel Smith and the UCP. These are conservative insiders, conservative strategists, people that advised Stephen Harper, Ken Bosenkool, for an example, Thomas Lukasik, who is very influential still in Alberta politics, a moderate conservative, Charles Adler, a national voice on conservatism, who has and continues to be vocal about what he's seeing going on and his concerns about it. And Jeremy Farkas, who was a very conservative member of the Calgary City Council, actually saying that he thinks that the UCP is dangerous and that Danielle Smith is dangerous, that this is going to material and perhaps irreparably damage democracy in Alberta. I've never seen those kinds of voices speaking out publicly and frequently the way that they are.
I was surprised about Ken Bosenkool's his concern and his comments that were reported in the National Post. And another example of that is Lee Richardson hosting about 40 people at his home in Mount Royal. So this brings me, you mentioned earlier, Laurie, about the polls, and I'm quite frankly confused. In the last week, we've had an Abacus poll, which had the NDP ahead, and then we had Janet Brown's lead poll. So can you unpack this for me and give me your impression of what it all means, if anything?
Well, the first thing, and these pollsters will tell you this, the first thing to bear in mind is that this is just a snapshot at a given point or short period of time. One of the differences between Janet Brown and the Abacus poll, David Coletto and the Abacus poll, is that Janet Brown, her poll went over a longer period of time, and Coletto's was just the last 3 days or so. But the other difference that might be significant is that Janet Brown has always been better at getting at conservative voters than other pollsters tend to be. And that's because she goes well beyond the online or, the first 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 attempts on a phone call. She continues, she and her pollsters continue to try to drill down and get things in more detail. All of that said, this is very fluid. I think it's soon or too difficult to sort of say where the momentum is going at this moment. But Abacus again today is saying that young people could make the difference if they get energized to come out and participate in this election. That could make a difference. And if conservatives who don't feel like they can vote UCP or NDP simply stay home, that could have an impact. So voter turnout could be enormously influential here. But the other thing that was really striking to me is that the Janet Brown poll was leaked. Mm-hmm. Why did the UCP folks leak that poll? If their own internal polling is lining up with that, why do they need to leak it? And right. Charles Adler actually commented on that. He said he respects Janet Brown, as we all do. She's the best pollster in the province, for my money. But precisely because of her record on accessing those conservative voters in her polling. What I suspect is happening is their internal polling may not be in line with this. And Charles Adler said that when he watches Danielle Smith, she does not look somebody who's confident of victory. She actually looks like she might be in trouble. We'll have a better sense of things, I think, on Thursday night with the debate.
Yes.
But yeah, this may be one of those elections where we don't know the outcome until the votes are actually counted on the 29th.
Thank you, Laurie. The other area an assumption which is made by political commentators is that there's these 41 seats outside Calgary and Edmonton that will almost automatically go to the UCP. And you've mentioned a number of ridings in these semi-urban, semi-rural communities. Red Deer South is a particular example. Now Roger Epp has written quite a lot about the rural communities in the province, and his argument is it's not homogeneous. Certainly over the last several years, there's been some very burning issues, which suggest to me that people are not necessarily going to vote for the UCP. Now, on the one hand, they might vote for even more extreme parties, what is the Wild Rose Independence Party or Freedom Party and so on. But the issue of unpaid municipal taxes and the issue of orphan wells, the issue of healthcare, it just, and the fact that the government, as you know, has been anti-union, the teachers being forced to invest with AIMCO, the hard negotiations which you talk in your chapter with between Taves and Shandro and doctors and so on. But they're nurses and teachers in these rural communities as well.
Yeah.
And of the 41 seats, I would say there's about 17 in kind of the medium-sized cities like Fort McMurray and Lethbridge. So can you just give me your thoughts about what you think is going to happen in rural Alberta?
Bob, you've done a great job of summarizing all of the reasons why some of these rural areas are really frustrated with the government. I would add to that two more things. One, Jason Kenney came in promising not to increase taxes. That was a promise, a guarantee. He increased the taxes on municipalities, the provincial portion of municipal taxes. So they're actually paying more to the government. They're getting less back from the government. They aren't getting the revenues that are owed to them by some of these large oil companies, and they are struggling. Many of these folks in these rural municipalities have oil companies who have money. They're profitable companies. They have money to clean up the messes they made. And because of Danielle Smith's first lobbying for the R-Star program and now proposing that money that belongs to Albertans, whether it be royalty or tax dollars that belongs to Albertans, will now be paid to these companies so that they don't have to assume the financial responsibility for the messes that were created. I don't care if they bought a company that had done the damage. They bought that company in the knowledge that this was a legal obligation they had. And even the organizations like Scotiabank are saying this violates free enterprise polluter pay principles. It's simply unacceptable. The other thing I would add is the wildfires. We're hearing a lot of those rural municipalities saying that they feel like the government isn't in touch with them, isn't listening to them, isn't responding to their needs and their concerns. And this could be an opportunity if handled or managed well. It could be an opportunity to offset some of the concerns about Danielle Smith's leadership. It doesn't look to me, at least so far, like it's had that kind of impact. It's probably been a bit of a wash. It's not particularly positive or particularly negative. But if people are angry enough and motivated to vote on the basis of that anger, that's another thing that could make a difference. So I actually was listening to somebody who's not a political scientist. Their specialty is quite outside, and they were saying, well, rural Albertans not get listened to by the government because they count on them to vote the same way all the time.
Right.
You add to all of this stuff, the healthcare issue and the fact that it's more difficult to access healthcare. It's more difficult to get docs and frontline healthcare workers. And we don't see a solution. These sort of private clinics that are doing surgery in this or that surgical facility, it doesn't make it any easier for those folks to get access to a physician. And I don't see any proposal on the UCP side for actually addressing that, other than sort of these bonuses that they're going to pay to people to come in to hopefully undo the damage that's been done to Alberta's ability to recruit folks. The healthcare issue is a big issue. It's a big problem. And, I think in a lot of these areas, it's going to be a bit of a mix. There were ridings in play. I think that maybe have become maybe more predictable than once they were. I'm thinking, for example, of Livingston MacLeod, with such a controversial candidate in Chelsea Petrovic, who basically blamed heart patients for their illness, which lines up again with some of the things that Danielle Smith has said. Again, blaming people that are sick for their illness. And that's all too common in our society, I have to say, generally speaking. People who take very good care of themselves still get sick. And I think that just has to be acknowledged, and a little bit more empathy for people that are struggling with serious illness is in order. So it looked to me like the NDP candidate, very well recruited, and the NDP's done a good job of recruiting quality candidates that are local. But there's revelations recently of things that have been written by Kim Van Tighem that are quite controversial, very critical of the oil industry. And although some of them are balanced and nuanced and the kinds of things that a lot of analysts might agree with. Some of the statements are going to really put off a lot of folks, because in that whole region, Livingston, McLeod, Banff, Kananaskis, those kinds of areas, the whole issue of mining and parks, which the UCP lost so much support in connection with. I think Miranda Rosen in Banff, Kananaskis is really fighting for her seat, precisely because she and the UCP so badly mismanaged both the mining and the parks management issues. The I guess breach of trust there with Rosen in particular, but with the UCP in general, might be a problem for them. But again, we're seeing a lot of dynamics sort of shift as more information comes out during the campaign, making some of these more difficult to predict.
And certainly one of the two more ridings that I would throw in the mix, and one I think you mentioned, is Red Deer South, where they have the city solicitor running for the NDP there. And in the case of Cochrane, you have a law professor from the University of Calgary. So these are very high quality candidates.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of more that I would also add just to the list, Lethbridge, because of they've got one obstetrician for the entire region. And when Danielle Smith, who wasn't at the time answering questions from reporters, was asked by a doc, what about the obstetrician shortage here? And she said, oh, the problem is anesthesiologists. And the doctor said, I'm sorry, no, that isn't the issue. The issue is we have one obstetrician for the entire region. Then Danielle Smith said, well, the lower risk patients can get midwives, and the higher risk patients can go to the big cities, but hopefully not too many. And the problem is anesthesiologists. Like even Ken Bosenkool wrote, she just handed Lethbridge to the UCP. The other place I think where candidate selection is going to be significant is in Calgary. So, for example, in Calgary Glenmore, there's an absolute star candidate in Calgary Glenmore, Nagwan Algunaid, who has industry experience both on the oil and gas side and the alternative energy side. A top 40 under 40, nationally recognized. I was talking to somebody who is an oil and gas person who spoke with her and knows her already because of her reputation. And he said, look, when the NDP was in last time, it hurt my business. What are you going to do about that? And her fulsome reply to that he's one of those folks I've been speaking to who's saying, I never thought I would say this, but I'm thinking about voting NDP. So the recruitment of really star candidates that got their finger on the pulse of an issue that's important makes a difference. Tyler Shandro in Calgary Acadia is up against a nurse. Jason Copping is up against one of the most respected neurologists in the city. And that's just a handful of places where the high quality candidates that have been recruited, and they're not just good, but they're also in most cases local. They're coming from the communities. They have ties. They've worked representing those communities on a city council or in some other capacity. And I think that has opened up possibilities that didn't exist in 2015. In 2015, a lot of the NDP candidates that won had been parachuted from the cities into rural ridings, and they didn't have the deep roots or connections there that could have helped the NDP to deal more effectively with some of the rural issues that came up.
And what role, if any, is Mr. Nenshi playing in the election campaign?
Well, I don't quite know what his connection or reach or influence is. A lot of the things that we're talking about today are things that we are seeing in part on social media. And a lot of the typical, reliable voters are in an older age demographic who may not be following what's going on social media. That could explain, at least in some cases, why the videos that are and audio recordings that we're seeing, or the commentaries that we're seeing, are not having, at least so far, having an impact on support for Danielle Smith in a significant way. It may be they just haven't been exposed to these things. So I don't know who is paying attention to Naheed Nenshi or Jeremy Farkas. I know they're both getting just hammered with people that are really angry about the things they're saying, especially Jeremy Farkas. And of course, Jeremy Farkas is plugged in to that
Yes.
community. He's quite conservative, but he's very concerned about what the UCP might do if they win this election. And so part of the problem is that both of them, and they're speaking together in a number of contexts, both of them are pointing to the issues that turn people against the progressive conservatives: entitlement, arrogance, even corruption in some cases. And so if your chances of being fairly treated depend on who you know, as some of the stories we're hearing seem to indicate, if there's no accountability or no consequences for taking advantage of your position, if equality under the law, equal access to the services that you need, if all of that is being undermined and gotten away with, that's exactly the kind of thing that turned people in large numbers against the progressive conservatives, both in 2012, I will say, and in 2015. It's important to note that in 2012, people who voted Wild Rose because they were angry with progressive conservatives voted NDP in 2015. So this isn't about ideology, right? For some people, it is about principle and values, and that can be encapsulated in conservatism or whatever other ideology people want to talk about. But most Albertans don't think of themselves as particularly ideological, but they are pretty disenchanted with some of the negative, the rot even that sort of built into the Progressive Conservative Party over 44 years. And I'm hearing from some of those folks who sort of said, well, we sent them to the penalty box for 4 years. We thought they learned their lesson. Looks like they haven't. Maybe we need to send them back. I'm hearing a lot of people I never would have thought would utter the words, I'm voting NDP. People who've been lifelong conservatives who felt homeless. They don't have a political home. Saying, I was at a election information session about a week ago, invited there by, I've been involved with this particular group for election talks more than once. Anyway, he at the end of the talk, he thanked me for the information and the discussion, and said, and I am going to be voting NDP, and I encourage everybody here to do the same. If I'd had a mouthful of coffee, it would have sprayed all over the room. And I'm hearing this, even in 2015, I heard people who say, well, I'm not an NDP, but Notley's a pretty good premier, whether they voted for the NDP or not. Now I'm hearing, I never thought I would vote NDP, but I'm thinking about it. Or they're just saying, I can't vote for this UCP government. I can't bring myself to vote NDP, so I'm just not going to vote.
Now, before we turn to the economy, I just wanted to get your thoughts about the financial, the donations to the UCP and where they're coming from. They've certainly picked up under Smith. They were suppressed under the UCP. People were dissatisfied with Jason Kenney. My sense is that it's coming from the small producers and explorers, the people behind our star that Smith represented at Alberta Enterprise Group. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Well, it's important to understand, first of all, there are limits to direct donations that can be made to a party or to a candidate. So even if it's an oil and gas company, we know that the energy industry in Alberta is divided. The progressive conservatives had the large oil companies, the oil sands companies, the ones that are doing most of the innovation in alternative energy as well, by the way. Those folks tend to be more associated with and supportive of the more centrist moderate folks, whereas the smaller companies were behind the Wild Rose and are also part of this. Some of it's grassroots donations, some of it's coming from third-party advertisers. And interestingly, Take Back Alberta is registered as a third-party advertiser. So they can't sort of directly try to influence campaigns, but they do have a bit of financial room here. And the new law also restricts the possibilities for union donations and participation in campaigns. And we've seen complaints made by the UCP that trying to make that association between Rachel Notley and her husband, who's involved in a union, and other things of that sort. On the other hand, we've seen some unions try, like for example, the Alberta Teachers Association. I've seen signs up to say, support public education. They're not endorsing one party or the other. They're really trying to push on an issue that they're hoping whoever becomes government will pay attention to, which I think is a wise strategy, by the way. But yeah, it's very much a different game in terms of the possibility of some of the money that is potentially influencing the campaign won't be sort of exposed until after the election. I think it should be reported currently, but the legislation doesn't require that. So it makes it a little more difficult to figure out where that money is coming from, but we know what the patterns of support have been historically.
So one of the themes that's come out in Notley's speeches is portraying herself as the party of stability and predictability, and the UCP as a party of disruption, instability, chaos. How is that, do you think, going to play out in this election?
Well, it will certainly resonate with some people who've been noticing the infighting. They've noticed that the attention hasn't been, if you look at what's happened since Danielle Smith has become premier, there isn't a long legislative record. There haven't been a lot of accomplishments. Certainly people are appreciating their $100 checks every month to try to help them deal with affordability, but they know that their utility payments have gone up by much more than that. Their grocery bills have gone up by more than that. They're perhaps paying a little bit less at the gas pump because the provincial tax on that gasoline is down, but the actual price of gasoline is up, and that, of course, increases revenues for the provincial government. So I'm just going to say sort of broadly that the prosperity of the province, the surplus, the revenues that are coming in at the provincial level, I don't think that's being felt by many Albertans. Increasingly over time, the oil industry has employed fewer and fewer people. So even in boom times, it doesn't generate the kind of employment it once did. When we're talking in the hundreds, not thousands or tens of thousands, it's shrinking and problematic from that point of view. We're also, I think, just seeing a gap between the experience of ordinary Albertans and this government's ability to even focus on what they're concerned about, much less address it. So we're seeing it again in the complaints about the wildfires. There are people that are complaining that the government is more worried about politics than they are about them and the crisis that they're facing. So to the extent that kind of instability, that kind of infighting, those kinds of questions about candidates, having to disqualify and replace candidates, or having videos of the sorts of things that they're saying, let's call it maybe instability or uncertainty, that sense of some people are describing it as chaos. In fact, a number of analysts as well as individuals are describing it as chaotic. And it's interesting because David Terrace said in 2012 that Albertans may want change, but they want safe change. They want stability. I mean, we're sort of small C conservative in Alberta. We don't like anything too radical or rapid. And that being the case, I think it's problematic for Danielle Smith and the UCP in that they haven't projected an image of stability, of competence, of people being willing to trust them, whether because they say different things in different contexts. It's, even trying to figure out what the Sovereignty Act was supposed to be about. Danielle Smith was saying it was meaning very different things that were quite incompatible. So that sense of confusion or uncertainty, I'll call it, I think is one of the liabilities that has emerged around the UCP, partly because of the party infighting. And of course, Danielle Smith emerging out of that party infighting and not sort of establishing stability since becoming premier, I think makes things difficult. By contrast, I mean, the favorability ratings in poll after poll for Rachel Notley are high. And again, we heard people even during her time as premier saying, you know, I'm not an NDP person, but I think she's doing a pretty good job. She's a pretty good premier. She's competent. And again, you know, people have been talking about there's a one poll recently that looked at who people trust to deal with a natural disaster or crisis. About 68% had confidence and faith in Rachel Notley. 18% had confidence in Danielle Smith. Now, is that going to be the thing that determines people's vote? That's the question.
Right, right. So for our final area, let's talk a little bit about Alberta, and I characterize it as a single commodity-based economy that's looking to diversify. In the first series of chats with Todd Hershey, was optimistic actually about the economy and talked about organic diversification from the innovation growing out of the climate change challenges. I take a more pessimistic view, and I'm quite concerned about the environmental liabilities, which are massive, that could potentially be dumped ultimately on the provincial government and basically form part of the debt, and it's a huge number. Recently, there's been the Curl Lake oil spills. There is phenomenal evidence that the Alberta Energy Regulator is not doing the job that it's captured by industry, and heartbreaking testimony in Ottawa by chiefs of First Nations downstream from those oil sands plants. So do you see any of this factoring in an election or people's choice?
I suspect a lot of those concerns are a bit too long-term, with the exception of this idea that, look, the farmers and the ranchers, coming back to rural Alberta, the farmers and the ranchers who continually contend with oil and gas companies coming onto their land and leaving them with mess, harming their water, perhaps engaging in fracking and experiencing earthquakes and all of these kinds of concerns, I think, could, in the long run, have a big impact. If it looks as though everything is is stacked, if you like, on the side of the energy companies, and First Nations farmers and ranchers, towns and cities are all having to do without or suffer consequences because they aren't taking their fair share of the responsibility. I think that could be problematic for sure. And I think that's something that's in the minds of a lot of people in Alberta already. They think that it is unfair. On the other hand, I think there's a bigger picture that needs to be looked at. And I have long puzzled about what strategy, if any, is at work in fighting against environmentalists, being sort of pro oil and gas, period. I think a balance between energy and the environment, or if you like, energy and the economy on the one hand, and an environment in the economy on the other hand. We've got world leaders, world respected people that have the ear of investors all over the world, like Mark Carney, talking about the necessity of striking that balance. And what's needed is a leader who has credibility on striking that balance. And I think we saw a lot of really good, at least openness to better will toward Alberta when Rachel Notley came into power. She got, or helped to get, a pipeline approved, and it's still being built. She was an NDP leader who's pro-business, pro-oil, pro-pipelines, but also pro-environment, and striking a balance and making her climate leadership plan with Indigenous people, environmentalists behind her, oil energy leaders behind her, and trying to find a compromise that would appeal across the range. And we saw the support for pipelines go, I think it was in 2018. In January, it was sitting at about 37% nationally, and it went up to about 68% by May or June of that year. I think we need something new on that count if we're going to actually succeed in getting the stable investment, and even if the liabilities you speak about are visited upon Alberta down the road, if it is seen as a province that takes the environment seriously and is doing the work that needs to be done realistically, not net zero in an unrealistic period of time. And Notley is making this argument against the federal government, saying, your numbers are wrong. They aren't going to work. This is unrealistic. We need to have a conversation about this. That kind of balance could, I think, be good for Alberta in the long run. It has to be said that Rachel Notley's climate plan had only one change made to it by Jason Kenney. He only got rid of the consumer carbon tax. He kept everything else, but you would never know it to hear what he said.
Right.
Danielle Smith's rhetoric is sounding very similar again. So, I just think for Alberta, it's important to recognize that energy is a huge part of not just our economy, but the national economy. But that balance between energy and the environment is absolutely critical to stable investment in the long run. And that's a challenge that I think could help forestall or at least limit the negative impacts that you're talking about.
Well, on that note, let's wind this up. It's been delightful talking with you, Lori, and thank you for your insights on the political scene in Alberta. And we'll keep in touch.
It's been great chatting with you, Bob. Really good insights on your part, and I hope this gives food for thought to folks that are thinking about how to vote going into the election in 2 weeks.